Baik, menurut laporan Jantina Global 2025 oleh World Economic Forum, jurang kesaksamaan antara Jantina adalah sejauh 100 tahun. Ini disebabkan langkah adaptasi dasar yang perlahan bukan sahaja di negara membangun, malah negara maju. Editor kanan Astro AWANI Najib Arif bertemu pengarah urusan World Economic Forum Saadia Zahidi.
Okey, separuh populasi dunia ni, hampir separuh adalah wanita, dan kita melihat angka yang dijangka oleh World Bank sendiri adalah sekitar 4 bilion populasi wanita, dan kita melihat bahawa jurang antara gender ini begitu ketara sekali dalam pelbagai aspek, khususnya di negara maju sendiri dan juga negara membangun sudah pasti. Apa yang sudah jadi dan bagaimana untuk kita merapatkan jurang ini, dan apa lagi indikator yang harus dilihat dalam mengukur jurang antara Jantina ini. Ini yang kita bincangkan di World Economic Forum untuk annual meeting of the new champions 2025 di Tianjin, China. Ini saya berhati saya bersama dengan Saadia Zahidi, iaitu pengarah urusan kepada World Economic Forum. Saadia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having
really
me.
Appreciate for your time. I want to talk about the global gender gap, because according to the report, 2025 global gender report, achieving full gender parity basically remains more than a century away. What went wrong, and then how do we improve this in terms of that? Because some of the countries that profess strong commitment to gender equality still facing the same problem.
Yeah. I think the pace of change is just simply too slow. So what you have there, the 123 years, is actually an improvement from the last few years, because things really slowed down in the midst of the pandemic. And now we've basically caught up with the trend that used to exist pre-pandemic. So when it comes to sort of a technical looking at the numbers, that's what's happened. But it's really fundamentally that progress is simply not going fast enough. And it's gone relatively well when it comes to progress on health, on education. The world overall is doing quite well on that. But when it comes to economic participation and political empowerment, it's just simply too slow moving.
But how do you see the progress between the global north and global south in terms of, making the gap closer?
I think there are countries both from the developed world as well as the developing world that are progressing relatively fast. So let me give you an example. When it comes to the global north, the countries that are among the top 10 are not just in the top 10 because they are doing better relative to everyone else, but a country such as Iceland, which is for the 16th year in a row as part of our rankings #1, it's doing well because it's competing against itself. It's been continuing to progress relative to itself. It's now closed 93% of its gender gap. It's the only country in the world that has done that. And then you've got countries such as Saudi Arabia, countries such as Bangladesh, the UAE, that have actually also made leaps of progress. And they are of course, in either the emerging world or in the developing world, but they're also doing extremely well. Now we're looking at relative gender gaps, right? We're looking simply at the differences between women and men, regardless of the overall opportunities. But when you look at it that way, you find that there's progress both in the developed world and the emerging world and the developing world.
I want to talk about the job sector, because women are overrepresented in jobs that is most vulnerable to AI, for instance, such as the administration and also retail. What should countries, do to ensure that the digital economy does not suppress or deepening gender gaps?
I'm going to add a bit of nuance to that. So, on the one hand, women are in jobs that are more likely to be disrupted by AI, but also women happen to be less in the pipeline of roles that are going into the AI industry or into adjacent industries that are using artificial intelligence and other technologies. And in addition to that, women tend to be in roles that are less likely to be augmented by artificial intelligence. So we've got sort of a three-part problem. And I think the solutions to that lie in, one, getting more women into STEM education, more young girls and women into STEM education. Second, making some additional effort. Companies will need to reach back out into colleges very early, not wait for recruitment at the very end. They will need to reach back out into universities to try to attract women into that sector, so that that's the job choices that they make. Third, companies will need to make sure that they're actually creating an inclusive environment. These environments tend to be very male dominated. Now, not in every part of the world. There are certainly parts of the world where women are fairly equal to men in terms of STEM education and STEM fields, but not everywhere. And by and large, in the majority of the world, these are quite segregated professions. And then the last thing that companies need to be doing is actually ensuring that not only are they recruiting women's talent, but they're actually progressing and promoting women's talent. In the STEM fields, the starting point is about 25% women going into entry-level positions, but by the time you get to the C-suite, it's only about 12%. So there's a massive drop to the top when it comes to STEM professions, in addition to coming in very low numbers. So all of that would need to be addressed. And then in addition to that, to deal with this problem of women being in sectors that are just generally more likely to be disrupted by AI, there needs to be more of a gender lens applied to reskilling and upskilling. In general, most governments need to do a lot more when it comes to fundamental reskilling and upskilling, but they also need to apply a gender lens to this, because women will be disrupted in different ways than men will be disrupted.
I want to take an example of Malaysia, because tertiary education, whether it's a STEM or vocational or formal tertiary education, women participation in those education are very high. But when it comes to workforce, the numbers has decreased because of, you know, they belong to families, they have kids, and etc. This is the forever problem. I think it's quite universal problems in that sense. But how do you foresee, or the corporate sector should do more in terms of providing the particular ecosystem that you mentioned just now to push the women agenda further, of having them as part of the workforce?
So I think, as you said, this is a universal issue, that more women are going into education relative to how many are going into the workforce. But I think in a country like Malaysia, there really are more women graduating from university than men, and so a lot of the high-skilled talent in a relatively high-growth economy is coming from women. And so what that then requires is more support, more inspiration to get into entry-level roles in some of the growing frontier industries. Second, a better care infrastructure. That's something that, again, many countries are grappling with, but more support in the care economy. And interestingly, that's also a job creator. Third, I think we need to value more those professions that do integrate a lot of women, right? So healthcare, education, nonprofit sectors, they integrate a lot of women, but they often tend to be the lower paid sectors. There needs to be more focus on valuing these sectors. I think we all saw during the pandemic that these are some of the most essential services that most of us need. So we need to then value and pay those appropriately. And then the fourth element is we also need to bring women into sectors which they're not currently present in. So the conversation we just had around technology, science, engineering, mathematics, those are areas where we need to bring more women in, and Malaysia, like other countries, would need to make those four types of efforts.
I want to look at deeper in Malaysia, for instance, because half of our population are women. So if we do not empower them, so we basically lost half of the potential of our economy. So I want to see, you know, on a global level, in that sense, how do we take women participation and gender equality seriously as part of the numbers in measuring economy and economic growth, rather than just look at, you know, GDP or per capita income? But women participation is the propeller for economic growth.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised a very important point. There's a very clear economic case for gender equality. You see that case at a team level, right? Teams that are more gender equal tend to be more innovative, more creative, because they have more diversity of thought, they have more types of knowledge coming together. You see that happening at an organizational level. So organizations that have more women in the C-suite or have more women in the boards tend to outperform those companies that have less women or less gender parity. And then the last way that you see that, and again, it's proven by data, is that countries that integrate more their female talent tend to be the countries that grow more sustainably, grow in a more inclusive manner, and grow in a more resilient manner. And they tend to, over the long term, outperform those countries that don't integrate women. So as an example, the Nordic countries, one of the reasons they remain some of the most competitive in the world is because as of the last 50 to 100 years, they've made a lot of effort to integrate women into the economy. So those are all of the business and economic cases that I think need to be very clear to everybody. And there's more to this, right? So look at the uncertain state of the global economy at the moment. What you need is solutions to multiple challenges on so many different fronts. And how will we create the best solutions? If we're innovative. And how will we be innovative? If we are more diverse and creative in the solutions that we create. So I think that logic needs to be understood much more fundamentally and then applied, because in most countries in the world, it is still women that are coming out from universities in higher numbers than men, which means most of the high-skilled talent is female.
Sometimes a lot of countries, especially developing countries, they have policies in place to empower women. But when it comes to political challenges, for instance, the changes of government or budget tightening and all that, it will somehow disrupt the whole policy in place. How do we do this? I know this is not an easy task to do, but how do we do this, and should corporate sector come along to ensure that whatever policy that we have that is good for women empowerment, which is half of the population, must go on, basically business as usual for this kind of policy, regardless of political challenge.
So this year for our Global Gender Gap Report, we partnered with the World Bank on their work on women, business and the law. And what they have found is that, one, to begin with, it's extremely important that the actual legal framework is in place to allow women's economic participation. Yes. Everything from bank account ownership all the way through to business ownership and the laws and regulations around it, and making sure that that is relatively easy for women. But then there's a second element, which is how are those laws actually being applied, and is there enough resourcing around ensuring that they're being applied in an equal way for women and men. Now, your question was a little bit different, and that was about policies changing with different governments, and I think it's a similar matter. So you can have policies in place, you can have initiatives that maybe start out in a big way, but they need follow through. And again, that has actually happened in certain countries in the world. So if we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, Saudi Arabia started out very low in the rankings on the global gender gap, and has now become, over the last 19 years that we have been doing this, it's one of the countries that has made the fastest progress. In just 2 decades, there's been a pretty fundamental transformation of the integration of women into the workforce. So I think it shows that where there is a political push, it is possible to take it forward.
I want to look at all the international report. Is either by World Bank or by World Economic Forum, by other firms as well. They tend to include, for instance, the climate risk into the financial planning, and also the other planning as well. But should we make gender reality as one of the macroeconomic factors in determining our achievement?
Yeah. I think the IMF has already said that gender equality is a macro-critical issue. It has to be looked into when they're looking at the overall performance of countries. We at the World Economic Forum have, again, for nearly 2 decades, been looking at this as a core economic issue. A very similar logic applies, for example, to investment in girls' education and research that has been done at the World Bank and at other places. So I think the economic case from international organizations has become very clear. It's now about the application of that case, and for countries, policymakers, business leaders to understand it well enough that they actually make it part of their decisions. And that's where a gender lens in key decision making is very important, and that's also where having more gender equal decision making teams is also very important.
Yeah, we had discussion in Davos about gender equality, and also here and many stages as well. But how do you foresee 5 years down the road, given that the world is facing uncertainty in terms of policies from the advanced countries as well? But how do you see 5 years down the road in terms of the gap?
I think there's both a risk facade to this as well as an opportunity here. So when it comes to the risk side, artificial intelligence, we've already spoken about that. There are major risks associated with that for women's professions. A similar thing happens when we look at the trade uncertainties, right? So trade-related professions have given women expanded economic opportunity and higher wages. So women tend to be paid higher wages when it comes to export-oriented sectors versus domestically oriented sectors. If now we start backtracking, or if there's a loss of employment in some of those export-oriented sectors, there's a possibility of losses for women, especially in jobs that have given them very good livelihoods over the last 20 or 30 years. So There are plenty of risks, but I would say the flip side also exists. When there is this much change in the world, it's also the moment for us to move beyond what have been considered previous wisdoms or what have been considered previous ways of doing things. This is also a moment where there could be a much faster acceleration around gender equality, because the business case is there, the economic case is there, the education case is there, and the world needs talent, right? We're also facing a demographic change that has never been faced in the world today. And so we need much more talent, both in developing countries and in developed economies. And so when it comes to the need for talent, that alone should be enough to push a lot of change in the next 5 years.
All right. Sadia, thank you so much for taking time during your busy schedule of the day. Thank you so much, Sadia. Okey, itu kita melihat bahawa apa yang saya sebutkan tadi, data dah ada. Di setiap peringkat sudah ada data menunjukkan kepentingan wanita itu untuk diperkasakan. Kini terpulang pada pembuat dasar dan kita sendiri di dasar swasta untuk menjayakannya. Sekian saja agenda AWANI untuk jam ini. Saya Najib Arif. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.